Psychology in Seattle.
Hey, deserving listeners. Today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the ethical considerations of mental health clinicians using public media, such as myself. By doing this podcast, use public media, but I also use Facebook and Instagram and lots of other things. And over the years, since I started doing this 11 years ago, I have been thinking about and looking up expert opinion and consulting and reading about other ethical considerations or ethical applications and applying it to how I'm using a podcast, the sort of thing I talk about. And it's really this brand new world. There's not a lot of therapists who do podcasting, and it hasn't been that long among us who have been doing it. And a lot of the other ethical guidelines or ethical scenarios have been discussed over decades. For example, having sex with a client, for example, is considered unethical. And it took us a while as an industry to figure that out. For the first several decades, it wasn't considered unethical at all. In fact, they didn't really even have an ethical code back then. And over time, they started thinking, we should probably look at this, we should probably look at that, we should think about it, we should look at the effect on clients, we should think about how it looks to the public. And over time, they wisely decided that it was unethical and eventually illegal in a lot of areas to have sex with a client. And with podcasting, there are ethical codes that can be applied to it, but it's hard to know exactly how they apply because it's really quite different. Like, just take the issue of self-disclosure or professionalism. Let's just take the issue of professionalism. Therapists, when I first entered the field in the mid-90s, the internet didn't really exist. Barely, you had Pine email servers and whatnot. And certainly people didn't have Facebook and all this kind of stuff. And so it was easy for therapists, for me back then, to be quote unquote professional, meaning that I represented the field well. Because while I was at work, I acted professionally. And when I went home, I acted like a idiot 26-year-old, like any other red-blooded American male in Seattle. And but I didn't worry about acting unprofessional because the chance of me running into a client or a coworker was like almost, zero. So I could be who I wanted to be. Well, in today's world with, you could be out at a party, someone could snap a picture of you, they could post it on Instagram, they could tag you on it or whatever, or they could even post it to your public media page, like your business Facebook page or something. And although, obviously there are privacy settings that you can set for all this kind of stuff, but it's just a different world now. And the industry, my industry in mental health, has been scrambling to try to figure out how to deal with that. Professionalism is just one of the issues. We also got confidentiality, multiple dual relationship issues, harm to clients, all this kind of stuff. And so I've been thinking about it over the years and basically just making up rules as I see fit to fit my idea of what I think is the ethical sweet spot, so to speak, of having a podcast and not harming anybody, including the public, by the way. It's not just your clients you're worried about, but also your students, the supervisees, and the public. And I had a system, and I developed it, and I felt pretty good about it. It was all in my head. I hadn't written it down at all. I had written some notes, but really it was all just in my head. I had a sense of what I could talk about on the podcast, what I couldn't talk about. Well, all that kind of changed when I was hired by a supervisee. So another clinician wanted me to supervise her. And she is also, she uses public media for her work as well and is quite well known. And so in that instance, for the first time, I was faced with a situation where I was not only monitoring my own behavior and my own micro decisions minute by minute, day to day, week to week, but I was also monitoring someone else's ethical behavior regarding using public media like Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and all these other kinds of things. And it was a different, and at first I thought, well, I can certainly do this. I've been doing it for 11 years. I can certainly supervise someone. But then as I got into it, I was like, wait, it's actually completely different because I have to download my decision-making model into this person's head sufficiently so that they can do it on their own, because I can't be there with them minute to minute. They have to have the ethical guidelines in their head so well that they can actually operate from those ethical codes, ethical guidelines, and not get in trouble in their own behaviors. And this person, the supervisee, was so heavily involved in public media that it was such that I couldn't monitor everything that they did. And so I thought, okay, well, I guess I'll just take some time to train this person, and maybe I'll start jotting down some notes so that I can send this person some guidelines, a bullet point list of things that they have to follow. And as time went on, I was like, well, wait a second, like, how do I really justify what I'm telling this person? And do I really know that this is the right thing? I have determined that it's good for my practice, but it's a whole different thing when you have to tell someone else to do something. I think a lot of clinician/supervisors, educators out there can relate to this. It's one thing for a clinician to have a sense of how they practice and what they do. It's a whole other thing to teach it to someone else and convince them to do it. And if that person, garners a complaint for some reason, you have to be able to justify your training of that person. So it's this whole other much higher level. It really increased the intensity of the situation tenfold for me. So as I made this list, I thought, you know what, maybe I should start looking into the literature. And as I did that, I found myself writing a several-page piece on this topic of the ethical considerations of mental health clinicians using public media, such as Facebook and YouTube and podcasting. And I became mildly obsessed with it. And over the span of, this was actually if you're following my deep dive life, I finished my deep dive on attachment, and this was my next obsession. And I spent all my free time on this. I would spend all Saturday, all Sunday reading and writing and researching and thinking about it. And so I wrote this paper, and at first it was just a short paper, and it bloomed into, like, I don't know, it's too big to publish in an article. It's too big to publish in a journal or a newsletter or something. It's several pages, but it's not big enough to be a book or something. Maybe it'll be a chapter in a book or something. And I thought as part of that, I would actually talk about it here on the podcast. And since it's rather technical, I thought I would make it a patron-only podcast. Sorry to you non-patrons. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about lots of different things. I'm going to talk about why clinicians should even use media in the first place. What are the benefits of it, to your life? What are the benefits to society and to clients and students and supervisees when clinicians use public media? Because the whole ethical consideration formula involves benefit versus risk. So if there's a little bit of risk and no benefit, then you shouldn't do it in general. But if there's tremendous benefit and there's some mild risks, then we tend to look at those situations in a way that says, well, maybe we should do it anyway because there's a tremendous benefit potentially. So I lay out all the benefits for clinicians using public media, not only to their clients and supervisees and students, but also to society at large. We really need to be doing more, and I talk about that. I talk about the risk to confidentiality and the literature around that. I look at the risk of boundary violations. That's a pretty big one for me in terms of monitoring that. I discuss at length the risk of harmful multiple relationships or dual relationships. For you clinicians out there, you know what I'm talking about. I talk about the risk of harmful self-disclosure in public media, which is a pretty big consideration. I also, as I was talking about earlier, I talk about the risk of harmful unprofessionalism and the risk of inaccurate publications, which is pretty easy to change, pretty easy to monitor. And then I talk about the ethical decision-making model that I propose. The questions one would ask while they are using public media and how to answer those questions effectively. Because ethical decision making is all about asking certain questions and trying to find the answers effectively. Then I talked about informed consent. I believe that if we are to be ethical clinicians, if you have a public media account of some kind, whether it's a podcast, YouTube channel, or even just a business Facebook page where you post things on there, you need to inform your people, whether they're supervisees or clients, about that and what your policies are. Do you respond if your client comments? Should your client even look at that kind of stuff? What are the risks of it? All those things need to be laid out prior to the person entering into a relationship with you. If you don't, you run the risk of being sued effectively because you didn't inform your client beforehand about the risks and the guidelines. And then I summarized the recommendations to clinicians depending on the level of public media that you're involved in. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor and a podcaster. I'm a podcaster. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast. I apologize for that. If you want to listen to this full episode, you have to become a patron of the podcast. If you're not a patron, you're going to listen. This episode is going to end soon. When you become a patron, you get directions to getting access to the full episode. Sometimes people email me and they're just like, so I was listening to the episode and and suddenly it just ended. And I'm like, oh, are you a patron? And they're like, nope. And I said, well, that's the problem. I thought I explained that. So I'm trying to explain it more fully right now. So go to patreon.com, become a patron of the podcast to get access to this and hundreds of other excellent episodes, if I might say so myself. Thanks a lot. Bye.